Welcome, investigator. Evil is on the rise. Crime is escalating. Our mission is to eliminate the crime by exposing evil, examine why it manifests, and highlight the brave souls that confront it every day. Join us as we work together to bring justice to every victim. Welcome to All Things Crime. Here's your host, Jared Bradley.
Hey, everybody. Episode 3 of my discussion with Detective Lindsey Wade from the Tacoma Police Department cold case. It's not like one crime, one individual. The majority of crime is being committed, if I could talk this morning, by a relatively small amount of the population. And you can, so in your experience, how many crimes did one individual, on average, I don't know if you even have ever even thought about this, but if you thought of like, say, homicides that you've investigated, how many of those homicides were actually committed by the same person?
Few. I mean, when you're talking about more serious crime, in my personal experience, I had very few where I had multiple offenders linked, or one offender linked to multiple homicides. But with sex crimes, it was a little more common to have one offender linked to multiple sex crimes. And of course, it's also very common to have, one offender linked to a homicide, but has convictions for, multiple convictions for property crimes, drug possession and burglaries. Those are very common. In fact, most of the DNA hits that are made, at least in Washington, to murder and rape cases, they come from offenders that got into the database because their DNA was collected for a nonviolent crime, like a drug offense or a property crime.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense. So as people are, I don't know, not necessarily punished to the extent that they should have been, then the recidivism rate just goes up.
Right.
And so if they're not really, kind of get a slap on the wrist for a property crime, then they'll move on to something more. It's almost like easy money. They just continue to pursue a criminal life, and then eventually they get up into the more serious crimes. And it seems like most of the population, that's kind of when they start paying attention, is when assaults and things like that happen. But in today's society, geez, I mean, you can, in some areas like California, you like an armed robbery, somebody could put a gun to your head, and that's a misdemeanor.
Yeah.
And to me, that's just insane.
Yeah. It's pretty frightening. And I mean, there are, quite a few states now that have arrestee DNA legislation. And so DNA is collected at the time of arrest for certain crimes, usually, felony crimes. And that has proven to be quite successful in many states in, solving cold cases. And it also, prevents that gap where, somebody's missing the boat in collecting the DNA once the person goes through the system. I mean, if you collect it right at the booking station along with the fingerprints and the photographs, just, you're not going to miss them. And so, there are quite a few states. I don't know if Utah has arrestee DNA legislation, but I actually had one of my very first rape cases that I was assigned back in 2004 was unsolved for, 13 years. And I had a DNA profile from my suspect. It was in CODIS with no matches. I had requested a John Doe warrant from the prosecutor. And so the prosecutor's office had charged the case, basically charged the DNA profile as John Doe to freeze the statute of limitations on the case. And lo and behold, I get a phone call like 13 years later out of the blue from the crime lab saying, hey, is this case still active? Has it been resolved? And I said, well, no, it hasn't been resolved. Why? the analyst told me that they had gotten a hit from an arrestee in Alaska. So the suspect had been arrested up in Alaska for an assault, and his DNA was entered into CODIS as a result of their arrestee legislation in Alaska, and he hit to my rape case in Tacoma from 13 years earlier. So I'm a big proponent of arrestee legislation, but I don't know if and when it'll ever, happen here in our state.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that is dependent on the standard politician that comes through, but it's, there's lots of checks and balances in our system, and I love that. But at the same time, if it's abused, it can be a real detriment to society. And I think in many aspects, that's kind of what the whole country is experiencing right now, is because, if we have a really lenient state on one side and a more strict state on the other, crime is naturally going to go up in the lenient state because people know that they won't be held accountable. And boy, especially California, you just see that right now. There's a number of people that I'm connected with on LinkedIn and different area, even Facebook, but you see some of the stuff that people are just getting away with in California. It just blows your mind. The thought of being able to walk into a store and steal up to $950 worth of stuff and just walk out, and there's absolutely nothing that'll happen to you.
Right.
You cannot have policies like that and expect crime to not just go crazy. Because to an average criminal, $950 worth of stuff, that's a lot of stuff. And they can turn around and make a few hundred dollars on the street really quick, and that can turn into a good drug trade, and then they can turn that and make thousands. So it's insane to have these kind of policies that I'm assuming in some of these district attorneys' minds that they are doing justice to society and to the perpetrators, but my biggest problem is on the back end of that are victims. And I think far too many that kind of get separated, they're not on the detective level. They're not on the, I don't know how many times you had to sit in somebody's living room and explain to a victim's family what happened and, how you're going to try to solve it. And that interaction by itself, I think for most people would be so strenuous and so taxing that they literally couldn't do it. And the problem is a lot of these people that are actually making policy and some of these district attorneys have never done that. Right. And therefore they lose complete perspective of the victim and the victim's family and the justice that they deserve. Yeah.
Oh, listen, you're preaching to the choir here. I was lobbying and advocating for some DNA law changes here in Washington over about a 4-year period. And so every session I would go down to Olympia and testify on, basically advocating for some changes to strengthen our DNA collection laws in the hopes of helping to solve cold cases. And I would take the mother of one of my victims with me, who was a cold case that I was working on at the time. And she would come and testify as well, talk about her daughter's murder. And, and her daughter had a case that was, there was DNA, but there was no match in CODIS. And so, sort of all leads had been exhausted. And, what are we doing to try to strengthen our DNA database and look at all these gaps in the system that we could correct? And I literally had one year when we were down there, had a legislator tell the mother of this murder victim, look, I'm really sorry that your daughter was murdered, but we're more concerned with the privacy rights of family members of dead inmates who might be traumatized if they saw their dead inmate loved one on TV being accused or linked to some new crime. I literally was like stunned. Like I was like, am I in the Twilight Zone? Did you just say that to the mother of a murder victim? Yes.
Oh, that.
So that's what I'm dealing with.
Yeah, that's so out of touch with reality. It's like, yeah, I'm sorry, but some hypothetical situation that somebody's, a family member or a relative of a convicted felon that died in prison that might be connected to a crime that they commit, another crime that they committed, especially something as heinous as sexual assault or murder.
Yeah.
And that's who you're worried about, as opposed to the mother of a victim.
Right.
Wow. Yeah. That honestly, in my opinion, those kind of people, especially legislators, because they're actually, I mean, this is so frustrating. I mean, to me, that is like, as an elected official, their first responsibility is the safety and security of their citizens. And I would think that in most people's minds, the safety and security of people that are not breaking the law would take precedence over convicted felons.
You would think. Yeah.
Oh.
The good news is that finally, after 4 years, we did get some legislation passed in the name of that victim and another victim in Tacoma, the two little girls I mentioned earlier. So we got this DNA law passed in 2019 in their name. So it's called Jennifer and Michelle's law. And it, it strengthened our DNA law in Washington. It's not perfect. I think we still have some work to do, but it was definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, in fact, before we get too deep into how crazy some legislators are, let's pivot to that case. Could you explain that case a little better?
Sure. So, this is the case that I mentioned, as kind of being one of those things that really stayed with me and made an impact on me as a child. So 1986, there were two young girls that were about my age who went missing and then were later found murdered about 4.5 months apart in the north end of Tacoma in two different parks. And both of the cases were unsolved. And because they were so egregious and it was just so shocking to the conscience to think that, a 12-year-old out riding their bike and a 13-year-old out riding their bike in the middle of the day could be kidnapped and sexually brutalized and then murdered in these beautiful parks in the north end of Tacoma that are family friendly, tourist destinations. It was just absurd. And so because the cases were unsolved, there really were no good leads and no good witnesses. Nobody saw these girls being taken. So it was like the boogeyman. And because of the similarities between the two cases and the time frame and the locations, it was believed that one offender was responsible for both murders. And Tacoma had not experienced anything like that before this or since, so it really made it seem even that much more likely that it was just one rogue offender.
So this is you said this is 1986?
1986, yes.
So what was Tacoma like in 1986?
I mean, it was in this particular area of Tacoma, the north end, it was very quiet, residential. very low crime rate. I mean, it was completely unexpected and just shocking to the community that something like this would happen.
So these girls were just riding their bikes in the middle of the day. And describe these parks. Are they big enough that they could hide this kind of an activity?
Yeah. So the Jennifer Bastian, she was 13. She went missing on August 4th, 1986. She lived pretty close to Point Defiance Park, which is a huge park. It's about 700 plus acres. And there's a zoo, an aquarium, a beach, lots of forested trails, and then these lookouts that look over the Puget Sound. So it's massive. And Jennifer had ridden her bike to the park that day to train for an upcoming race. And so she left a note for her dad saying she'd be home by 6:30. It was not uncommon for her to ride at the park, although she normally rode with a friend. On this particular day, though, she went by herself because her friend was not available. So there were several witnesses throughout the day that saw Jennifer riding on the 5 Mile Drive as she had intended. So this is basically a paved road, kind of a 5 mile loop within the park. And so, later these witnesses came forward and several people described seeing Jennifer, and no one saw anything out of the ordinary or anything that looked suspicious regarding her. 6:30 p.m. comes and goes, and she's not home. So her dad sets out around the neighborhood looking for her. Some neighbors join in the search, and they retrace her route to the park and come up with nothing. So they call the police. Now, when the police come, they immediately were concerned that this was more than just an overdue child, because 4.5 months earlier, another little girl was abducted and murdered and found, within another community park that was about 1.5 miles away. Smaller park, not known to people outside the area, more of a neighborhood park, if you will. That case was unsolved at that time, and so it was like, okay, do we have another one? So they immediately called out search and rescue. They had bloodhounds that came out to the house and tracked Jennifer's scent from the house to the park around the 5 Mile Drive, but they did not find any trace of Jennifer. So that the park was closed down for 3 days, or the 5 Mile Drive within the park was closed for 3 days while they conducted this massive search. They had search and rescue volunteers from all over the state that responded on horseback, ATV, on foot. And after 3 days, they still didn't find anything. So the investigation, there were lots of red herrings within the investigation. There were, there was a black van that was thought to have been involved at one point, but that was later ruled out. So it was just puzzling, because as much interest as there was within the media and the public, it just never got solved. And the case 4 months earlier, and the reason I'm not going into detail about the first case is because it has not been adjudicated. So I'm not going to go into details on that one yet, because the suspect is in jail awaiting trial. But in the first case, I will say that there was DNA that was collected from the victim's body and put into CODIS, and it didn't match anyone. So, all these years, there was this one DNA profile thought to be the DNA from the suspect in both cases. And really, for about 28 years, both cases were investigated as if they were committed by the same suspect, for the reasons that I gave previously. Then in 2012, there was kind of a bombshell, and that was we finally obtained a DNA profile in Jennifer's case and it came from her swimsuit. And that profile did not match the DNA from the other case. And it was from semen, so we knew it was the suspect's DNA. So now, after 28 years of thinking one guy committed both these crimes, all of a sudden we're thrown into this situation where we have to go back and basically reinvestigate the case, because there were many, many suspects who were eliminated because they were not available for one or the other crime. You know, if they were in jail for one, they were eliminated for both. So that had to be re-evaluated, and people had to be looked at again, because now we're having to separate these two cases and look at them completely differently, with the understanding that we have two completely separate and distinct suspects in these two crimes that are almost nearly identical. It was interesting. We got excited because it's like, okay, well, we've got DNA, but, much to our chagrin, again, the DNA from the suspect does not match anyone in CODIS. So we're back to square one. And over the years, there had been a number of suspects that had been tested. Early on, they were taking hair samples and doing, blood typing and collecting hairs from people, because that's really, what they did in '86. And then eventually, people were eliminated through DNA testing. And, the people that really stood out to the original investigators as being prime suspects were all eventually eliminated through DNA. And so it just came to a point where it was like, okay, either the case is going to be solved by some guy somewhere getting arrested finally, and getting his DNA put into CODIS. Because my working theory on the case was that, hey, maybe this guy just, since I'd known from Ted Bundy and all these others, a lot of these guys are slipping through the cracks and they're not in CODIS as they should be. Maybe this guy is rotting away in prison somewhere in another state or in Washington, for all I know. Maybe he died in prison. There were all these theories about who this suspect was and how he could have evaded capture all these years. Because even though we had, by this point, recognized that we had two separate suspects, we also knew that based on the level of violence, the predatory nature of the murders, it was likely that this was not a one and done, that the offender, like in Jennifer's case, this probably wasn't his first or his last victim. So I felt really strongly that he was somewhere identified as being a sexual deviant that, and for whatever reason had slipped through the cracks. I would later come to find out that I was completely wrong, and that, as it turned out, this guy had pretty much no criminal history.
Thanks for joining us. Your attention today brings us one step closer to exposing and eliminating the evil that brings crime to our communities. Hit subscribe and share this episode. Together, we will bring justice to every victim.